Welcome to M&A Mondays, the UK's first YouTube series dedicated to all things M&A. From interviews with the leading figures in the industry, to coffee chats with analysts, diversity panels, all the way through to workshops, we'll be covering it all. We do hope you enjoyed the video, and please give us a like and a follow on our social media. Thank you very much.
Hello everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of M&A Mondays, the UK's first YouTube series dedicated to all things M&A. Today, however, we're joined with a very special guest who will be sharing his insights into the world of restructuring. I'm Yash Parekh, the founder and co-head of the UCL M&A Group, and I'm joined today with Tim Lee, the events executive and an analyst in the TMT team.
Today we are absolutely delighted and honoured to be joined by Dorian Lowell. Dorian graduated from the University of Oxford before completing his master's at the similarly prestigious Harvard Law School. After graduating, he joined the law firm Cleary Gottlieb before pivoting into financial restructuring. Since leaving the firm in 1996, he's had an incredibly accomplished career within finance, having held positions such as director at Houlihan Lokey and partner at One East Partners.
Dorian is currently a partner at Gleacher Shacklock, as well as heading their restructuring and debt advisory division. We are truly grateful to have him here with us today. So without further ado, let's get straight into it. Hi there, Dorian. How are you?
I'm well. Good morning. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning, and thank you for joining us today. I guess if we dive straight into the first question, Tim mentioned that you studied law at University of Oxford and then at Harvard. So my first question was, what made you shift from a career in law to finance, and then more specifically, investment banking?
So a number of reasons. So I always wanted to be a lawyer. Then I decided I'd always wanted to be a lawyer in the States. So I gave up on London. I did go to the bar and I did a pupillage at a commercial set of chambers, 3 Essex Court. And then I got this place at Harvard. So I went off to do law at Harvard. And then I always wanted to practice in New York and I wanted to be an attorney. So off I went and became an attorney. And then I had real culture shock because at that time, when I became an attorney in 1987, the difference between the hours that were worked in London by London-based lawyers and the hours that were worked by US lawyers in New York was very wide. And US lawyers, particularly in New York, work incredibly hard. And so I went through this very brutal and bruising sort of period of working round the clock. And I did it for about 6 or 7 years. And I decided this is not the life that I want to do. So that was sort of one part of it, just the workload. And this sort of never-ending volume of law that you have to keep up with in the United States. But also, I got into restructuring at Cleary Gottlieb, and we did some very, very large, complicated transactions. And then we got on a deal up in Canada, and I went up with the senior partner of Cleary to negotiate this deal up in Canada. And we cut the commercial deal in about 4 days, because we didn't use a financial advisor, and the client was happy for us as lawyers to basically reach agreement on commercial terms. But then because we were the lawyers, we had to go and document it. And it took me 6 months to document this transaction. So it was four or 5 days cutting a commercial deal, then took 6 months to document and complete. And I just thought that ratio is just all wrong. You're much more fun and much more interesting, I think, if you have a bent for finance, to be on the financial side, and then much easier to hand over all the sort of the legal work to a lawyer or a law firm. And so I just decided at that point I didn't really want to continue doing law. I like restructuring, and I thought it'd be much more fun to I'd get more satisfaction, I suppose, out of being a financial advisor. So that's really, it was that was the event that for me decided that I should transition. But it took me quite a long time to transition over as well. I left it quite late.
Yeah, fantastic. And I think you mentioned like the massive cultural shock when going to New York. So that leads me nicely onto my next question about you've had experiences working both in New York and London. Were there any major challenges? I know you touched upon the working hours as a lawyer, but in finance, were there any differences in culture? Did you face any other challenges? And just generally, how was the culture in New York compared to London?
Well, I think at that time, my sense was that transactions, M&A, restructuring, corporate finance was probably more sophisticated in New York than it was in London at the time. I think London's massively caught up. I mean, if you look at London today, it's dominated by US law firms and US investment banks, and the English merchant banks sort of gone away now. So to that extent, sort of globalization has reached into financial services. So London today is probably on par with New York, but the US is a vast legal system and has a vast and very deep debt and equity capital markets. And so that was one of the reasons I went out there, because I just thought it was going to be more complicated, more sophisticated, and and I was very attracted to the idea of working in the States. It felt to me that you were then going to be, you might be a small fish in a big pond, but it's a really big pond, and there is. And I learned a tremendous amount. And I think I learned stuff there that I would never have learned in London.
Thanks for that answer. So kind of pivoting towards Gleacher Shacklock in your current role, what do you think differentiates them from other banks, and why did that appeal to you when joining?
Why did joining Gleacher appeal to me versus other banks?
Yeah.
Because the reason I went to Gleacher was because before I was at Gleacher, I was at a hedge fund, and I joined a hedge fund after Houlihan Lokey because I was invited to join a startup hedge fund in New York. So I went from London back to New York with this hedge fund, and then they sent me to London to build up the London office. And then the financial crisis hit in 2009, and so we closed the London office because, like all hedge funds, a lot of our investors pulled their investments, and so we just closed down the London office. And at that point, there were no other hedge funds were hiring. I mean, but for the financial crisis, I would have stayed at a hedge fund. But anyway, the financial crisis caused the closure of the London office, so I then decided that really I had no choice but to go back onto the advisory side. And I had a long negotiation with Perella Weinberg because I knew the restructuring guys at Perella Weinberg in New York, but that didn't go anywhere. We couldn't agree terms. And then a headhunter approached me and said, there's this boutique in London called Gleacher Shacklock. They want to set up a restructuring group. And so I went and interviewed, and I said, look, I'll come on one condition, and that is you give me my own platform, you let me do what I want to do. I have decisions on hiring and firing, and that negotiation took like half an hour, and they said fine, whereas Perella Weinberg had gone round and round in circles for weeks and weeks. So I just called up Perella Weinberg and I said, forget it. They were very upset, and off I went to Gleacher, and that's how I did it. So it was simply the way circumstances sort of evolved at that time, and it was very specific because of the financial crisis.
Yeah. Also, you've worked on an extensive range of really interesting mandates. So out of all of them, are there any that particularly stand out to you? And could you tell us a bit more about them?
So I think we have had a pretty good run. I mean, there was a time when some of the magazines like IFR used to award Restructuring Deal of the Year, and we won it 5 times. So we have done a whole bunch of transactions that people said were probably impossible. So I guess 2 stick out, but it'll take too long to go through 2 of them. But one of them was a French utility company in France, which had 2 billion of debt and was owned by 2 private equity funds. No, 1 private equity fund, and the French government also had a an equity interest in it. They were a shareholder as well. And we pitched, we were one of 7 financial advisors that pitched. We did a very extensive pitch book. We analyzed the capital structure meticulously. They had a lot of swaps outstanding, out of the money swaps, and they were senior secured lenders. And we pitched against Goldman Sachs and a whole bunch of others. And we spent so much time on the pitch, and our analysis was so good, we won the pitch. And we said that we came up with a strategy where we basically said to the senior secured banks, put in new money, adopt the management's business plan, and reduce the amount of debt, take the write down of debt, and convert all your debt into equity, and eliminate and cancel all the existing shareholders' debt equity, which had never been done in France before. France had a long history of preferring shareholders over creditors, and forcing banks in particular to write down their debt and take an impairment, even though shareholders remained in place. And we teamed up with what was then the Italian advisory boutique called Leonardo, because they had a very good guy in Paris. So we pitched jointly, and we said, under no circumstance should you allow any of the equity to remain outstanding, and you should get all the equity. And that's what we did, and we implemented it. And we did what's called a cram down, and we crammed down the existing shareholders. They got absolutely nothing, 0. And the banks took the equity and they put in new money and they restructured the debt. It took about 1.5 years to do. And then I suppose 3 or 4 years later, I think they sold it for about $1.5 billion. They made a stack load of money. And it was unprecedented in the French market. And we had furious rows with the French government. We used to go down to Bercy, where the Ministry of Finance was, in their very ugly 1970s building. And we just had shouting matches with the Ministry of Finance. And I used to say, non, 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 non. And no, we're not going to let you keep an equity interest. And it went to auction, and other people emerged at the auction to try and buy the company, but all those offers were conditional on very large write-downs for the banks, and they couldn't do it without bank consent. And so the banks took it. And in those days, who was on the bank committee? It was RBS, it was Natixis, it was BNP. I mean, some really big banks, and some hedge funds also came into it. But we put in new money, which was quite critical. So that was a good deal.
That sounds like quite an experience in France, and actually leads nicely onto the next question as well. When you talked about specifics to restructuring, are there any specific skills do you think that are tailored towards restructuring? Because you've had experience in a hedge fund and other corporate finance areas. Do you think there are certain skills which help people excel in restructuring compared to other areas of finance?
It's got a very large legal content. I mean, you really do have to go through the legal content comes in 2 parts. One is you've got to plow through the financial documents. And so whether it's the security documents or the whether it's a New York indenture or whether it's a LMA, senior secured facility agreement. So you have to be prepared to plow through that. And then the other thing is the backdrop of every restructuring. There is an insolvency alternative. If you don't restructure on consensual terms, then the chances are the company's going to go into administration or insolvency in whatever the local jurisdiction is. So you have to be aware as to what the sort of the alternative is or the court procedures are. And it's also there's also sort of a lot of legal content in what we call the implementation mechanism. If you reach agreement amongst all the stakeholders, somehow you have to implement it so it's binding on all the stakeholders, because you very rarely get consent from 100% of all lenders, for example, or 100% of all shareholders. So you have to go through procedures in order to bind the final agreement on all the shareholders or all the creditors. In England, we do that through a scheme of arrangement. In France, if you go through conciliation, you do have to get all lender consent. If you go to Scandinavia now, you can put it through a Dutch scheme. In Ireland, you can do it through an Irish examinership. So you can, in Germany, they've modified their laws. So that is a detailed sort of legal procedure that you have to sort of understand as well. But there are plenty of restructuring advisors in London who don't have a legal background. And I also think having been on the buy side in a hedge fund has also been helpful. Sort of understand how hedge funds think and work. And but this is all stuff that you can learn on the job.
Yeah, okay. Thanks, that sounds really interesting. Our final question today is, what advice would you give to younger people looking to go into investment banking, and what can they sort of expect from the industry?
Let's start with expectations. You do work long hours. You have to have, I think, a bent towards sort of figures of finance. You got to get to grips with, you know, everything from reading, you know, the accounts to having a feel for how the financial markets work. And it does require a lot of stamina. I mean, there's no doubt. You know, people do. This is a hard-working industry. Yes, people get well paid, but they certainly earn it. And so I think, you know, you should go in with your eyes wide open. You're going to work long hours, weekends, and it's a fairly high-pressure, stressful job. But that's something you learn to live with and manage. And then when you're used to it, it's no big deal. So I think that's sort of, it's important to understand that from the get-go. I do think a lot of people think it's all very glamorous. There is an element of glamour about it in some respects, but I do think we do see quite a lot of churn. You know, people come in because they think they're going to get well paid, and it all sounds very interesting, but there is quite a lot of let's say, I wouldn't call it drudgery, but there's a lot of detailed, meticulous work that you have to do, and it's time consuming, and so you have to be prepared to do it. And I think the most important thing is judgment. You got to have really good judgment. You got to be able to have an empathy for the deal, for your clients, as to how other stakeholders are involved in a transaction, and that's something that comes with experience, but it's also something you've probably got in any case. And it's what I call, you know, you've got to have a feel for the deal. You've got to sort of understand what the commercial implications are, what's important for the client. For some clients, you know, some things that you don't realize are much more important to it than what you might think is important. So you've got to be able to, you've got to have the empathy to understand that. And judgment's a really hard quality to define, but it comes from experience. But we also see analysts who come in who seem to have an immediate grasp for it. It's rare, but there are people like that.
Fantastic, and thank you for that piece of advice. I'm sure our viewers who are keen to break into the industry will really benefit from that. And I just want to say thank you to you as well, Dorian, for taking the time to speak with us today. And for those watching, please do give the video a like and do subscribe to our YouTube channel. See you guys for the next video. Thank you very much.
Thank you, gentlemen. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.